So I'm a Christian woman, but what did that look like? Well, it turns out it can look different in different places. I grew up in a rural farming community. I've lived in urban contexts as a student and in academic situations. And I've spent decades in the Middle East, living in small urban centres and in huge megacities, visited other countries, whether they're Western, Middle Eastern, or countries dominated by other religions. Living in all of these different places have involved different tasks to be managed in daily life and work, different ways of dressing and of walking, ways of talking, including languages and the content of what we talk about, ways of relating across genders and between adults and children, different ways of being a woman. So we need to look both at the Bible and at other cultures to gain a full understanding of what it means to live as women and men of God. In over 2 decades of living in the Middle East, I've learnt so much from my Middle Eastern sisters about the shared humour of being women, doing life together. They've taught me so much of new ways of being a woman, in the challenges of daily life, of courage and of celebration, of how to do things like going shopping, drinking coffee together, doing housework, living out faith, sharing in family celebrations, feasts, fasts and funerals. But what does the Bible tell us about being women? Well, turns out the Bible firmly establishes the identity of women. The very first chapter of the Bible tells us that all women with men are made as image bearers of God. Together we carry the divine image, and it's not more grounded in one sex or the other, in Genesis 1:27. In the second chapter of the Bible, we read that God made woman out of exactly the same substance as man in order to be a sustainer to man, in Genesis 2, chapter 18 and 20. The word sustainer, or ezer, is linked with strength, often military strength, and with rescue. And in the majority of times when this word appears in the Bible, 16 out of the 21 times, it refers to God as the helper of his people. From the first 2 chapters in the Bible, we discover that women are doubly godlike, made in the image of God and made to be sustainers of men, like God. Is God male? All the language, pictures tend to present God as male, and we get this image in our head. But God is more than gender. He's beyond male and female. Within that, there's lots of female imagery of God in the Bible. We have God described as a woman. In Psalm 123, verses 2 to 3, as a woman carefully sweeping her house to find out what's lost. In Luke chapter 14, and a woman baking bread in Matthew 13 and Luke 13. Many of the female images of God are really maternal, a mother eagle, a mother, nursing, comforting, nurturing, and also full of maternal fury. God's like a woman in labour in Isaiah 42, giving birth, Deuteronomy 32. Every time we read in the Bible about sheltering under the shadow of God's wings, it's a maternal image of God and the female bird who offers shelter to shield her chickens from danger. I remember one time I was at a writer's retreat halfway through, and I got word that one of my children was quite sick. I dropped everything. I cancelled all my involvement in the retreat. I booked a ticket. I flew up. I dropped everything to care for my child. At that moment, I was being godlike. That was God's image in me, caring for his children. It's important to notice the Bible doesn't prescribe what motherhood looks like, whether women bring up their own children, whether it's servants, childcare, grandparents. But as those who nurture others, we look to God to find our true image of motherhood. The Bible honours mothers, but not only mothers. Women who are notable because of what they do for God, and we've no idea whether they're married or mothers or single, like Deborah. And women in the Bible, unlike in so many other cultures, including the Middle East, are known by their own names. We were preaching the other week on Matthew 25, the parable of the talents. Now that parable is one of the male-female pairs in the Bible, pairing with the story of the 10 virgins just before it. There's so many male-female pairs. Many of them come up in Luke, Mary and Zechariah, Simeon and Anna, the woman searching for her lost coin, the man searching for his lost sheep. We find them in Acts 2 Ananias and Sapphira, Priscilla and Aquila, Lydia and the jailer at Philippi, men and women, men and women. It's repeated over and over again through Acts. It's also in the other Gospels too. For in John, for example, we've got chapter 3, the long conversation with Nicodemus, chapter 4, the long conversation with the women at the well. And we see this pattern of male-female pairs in the epistles. 1 Corinthians 7 is a classic, man, woman, wife, husband. Paul says the wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And friends, that's known right throughout the world. But it goes on to say, likewise, the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but the woman does. That is radical in all cultures. With all this strong pairing, male-female pairing occurring in the Bible, people argue that it must go back to Jesus. And indeed, its roots, so my Old Testament colleagues tell me, can be found in the Old Testament. You get male-female pairs there. But what are the implications? That means all our own sermons, our teaching, should include both male and female examples. I've listened to a couple of talks given by men who I respect and admire, but when all their examples are male, there's nothing in it for me to identify with. It's really important that our teaching on the Bible, as the Bible itself, shows that as women as well as men, we identify with and respond to the content. I've asked some of my colleagues around the world about what the characteristics of being a strong or an honourable woman looks like in their culture. I wonder what you'd say a strong or an honourable woman looks like. And I want to suggest the picture is different in different cultural contexts. For example, in Tanzania, thanks to Tammy, a good woman is a strong woman. Women tend to be stronger than men. They do the child rearing, they're working in the family business or the farm. The picture of a Tanzanian woman has a child on her hip, the bucket of water on her head, the hoe in her hand. She's mother, provider, farmer. What pictures does the Bible give us of the strong, the good, honourable woman? What are we to do with the three women we read about in Proverbs? The first two give us pictures of an honourable woman and a shameful woman. And they're using almost the same language, the same terms as they call to passers-by. In Proverbs chapter 9, verses 3 to 6 and verses 13 to 17, wisdom is pictured in Proverbs in female terms and is part of God from the very beginning, in Proverbs 8. And then Proverbs chapter 31, verse 10, famously has the description of a woman of valour, Chael. Look at what she's involved in: business and trade, clothing and agricultural production, real estate, teaching, philanthropy, managing staff and care for her household. And in many common arrangements of the Hebrew Bible, this last chapter of Proverbs is followed immediately by the book of Ruth, who is described in chapter 3, verse 11, as a woman of valour, a woman who's chael. This word valour, when it's used of men, describes warriors of strength and courage, or sometimes wealth. Hence it carries connotations of power, and it's used of a married woman in Proverbs and of a single woman in Ruth. The Bible does not suggest that women should be weak. In the Bible we have the book of Ruth and the book of Esther. What do they tell us? We have the book of Ruth set in a village amid agricultural seasons, and the story of Esther is set in the central province of an empire ruled over by Xerxes, or in the Bible Ahasuerus, an empire which stretched over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Each woman is a foreigner in the land where her story is told, and as they're caught in the uncertainties of famine, war and displacement, they act with faith, obedience and extraordinary courage in the situations, historical and cultural, in which they find themselves. What's the place of these books in the Bible overall? The history of the people of Israel is divided into two sections as they settled in the land where God promised them, the time of the judges and the monarchy that followed. The book of Judges is an account of a spiral down into disobedience, which is marked in part significantly by the treatment of women in the book. And the book concludes with the statement of a people descended into complete anarchy in Judges 21. In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. The monarchy after David is also a story of overall national decline, a few ups but continually going down, which led to Israel and then Judah being taken away out of captivity from their land. So at the end of 2 Kings chapter 17, the people of Israel sinned against the Lord their God, which had brought them up out of the land of Egypt. So Egypt was exiled from their own land to Assyria in this day. And again, in 2 Kings 24, Jerusalem and Judah so angered the Lord that he expelled them from his presence. So Judah went into exile out of its land. So against these histories of national disobedience and decline, the Bible sets the stories of Ruth and of Esther. Ruth almost at the end of a period of judges, and Esther after all the people have gone into exile, left the promised land. Has it all been a failure? The two women show through their lives of faithfulness that God is still acting in covenant redemptive faithfulness amongst this people. Even in the face of what seems like an overwhelming turning away from God and from his ways, or what looks like national disaster, God is still fulfilling his redemptive purposes. And we see it played out in the lives, courage and action of the two women, the peasant Ruth, the princess Esther. So out of this, I want to say what we get in understanding women in the Bible is that they're defined primarily by their obedience to God and how they contribute to his covenant people, not by their roles. We're wrong to ask what roles women can and can't have, what they can and can't do. We need to ask about relationships. In the New Testament, they're defined by their relationship to Jesus as his disciples. Domestic duties, think Luke 10, Martha and Mary, and even family, including the most important relationship of mother, are both trumped by obedience to Jesus and learning from his word. Matthew 12:46 and further on, and Mark chapter 3, verse 31 to 35. It's all about how we're relating to God, how we're relating to Jesus, how we're relating to his people in a way that builds up and honours him. Women have all kinds of roles in the Bible. They're judges, they're mothers, they're prophets, they're teachers, they're midwives, they're hostesses, but they're not defined primarily by their roles, but by relationships that honour God and others. And that's what matters, how we live and love and honour God and people, not the professional and domestic context, not the roles in which we do that relating. So this is about relationships and attitudes rather than specific acts or behaviour, because what demonstrates helping love or being a strong, honourable woman, or alternatively a loving, courageously self-sacrificing man, in one culture might look different in another culture. In one culture, to pick up your shopping and carry it for your wife might look noble and helpful in the man. In another culture, you're proclaiming to everyone that your wife is lazy. In every culture, men and women have particular roles, but the lines differ in different cultures. They're not drawn in the same place in every way. So we need to ask what behaviours communicate these attitudes and relationships of mutual honour and service in each context. So we see some cultures have women and men living in quite similar social roles. Other societies are more divided along gender lines. For example, Tanzanians understand masculinity and femininity to be different but opposite, and strength is built into their understanding of what a good woman is. This means there's space for female leadership, which is not a threat to men, because they're not competing for the same space. Maybe we need to ask sometimes, is this a patriarchy operating, where men have all the power, or is it a heterarchy, where there's two different systems of power, two different systems of leadership operating? And it's worth noting that we often encounter more strong women in cultures or communities that divide on gender lines. Australia's only female Prime Minister to date didn't serve a full term, and no woman has yet been Prime President in the US. But a number of Muslim countries had female presidents before some of the Western democracies, including Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Senegal. In some cultures, hierarchy and family lines are more significant than gender in people's roles. In the New Testament, we see the women who travelled with and provided for Jesus and the 12 disciples out of their own resources in Luke 8, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and many others who were patrons for Jesus and his disciples. The Bible doesn't ask all cultures to function the same way, but it also questions each culture. The household codes in the New Testament offer a new perspective on cultural hierarchies in Ephesians 5, Colossians 3, and we also see it in 1 Timothy, Titus, and 1 Peter. They don't demand immediate equality between husbands and wives, masters and slaves, parents and children, but neither do they uncritically reinforce the existing hierarchies. Rather than just having to obey those further up the hierarchy in a one-way flow of accountability, the New Testament requires responsibility and accountability to be now reciprocal, going both ways in relationships in the framework of mutual honour, mutual authority and mutual submission, as we see in 1 Corinthians 7, 3 and 4 and Ephesians 5:21. Biblical leadership by women and men is defined by kindness and sacrificial service, and the higher you are up the hierarchy, the more the sacrificial the service is. So how do we live? In Australian society or elsewhere in the world, who are our models in the Bible, in our community, in history? When we look back at Ruth and Esther, look at the pairs, Ruth and Orpah, Vashti and Esther, and it's important to note that Orpah and Vashti aren't criticised, which suggests that wherever we are, it's not a matter of doing just what's not wrong, what's not going to be criticised, but be ready to go beyond other examples, to follow God in costly ways, to look at the examples, but if necessary, to go beyond in what it takes to follow God, to honour him, to honour and build up his community. When we look at women in the Bible, I want to suggest a few questions that we need to ask. The first question, why is her story in the Bible? Next, what does her story teach us about God? Then, what lesson can we learn from our own lives from this woman? Then, importantly, what are the cultural expectations of and possibilities for her as a woman in that situation? How much agency or initiative does she exercise, or is she just a passive recipient of circumstances? And my thanks to Miriam for these questions. And lastly, why does the Bible include this woman? What point is the text making? With this clip, there's a biblical overview of women, a PDF looking at how we might view a reading of the Bible through the different women and the kinds of roles they've played in his community. And I'm going to suggest you might like to refer to that. But for now, here's 4 women you might like to think about and ask those questions of. Deborah in Judges 4 and 5, Abigail in 1 Samuel 25, the stories of Mary and Martha in Luke 10, and Lydia in Acts 16, verses 12 to 15 and verse 40. Ask, why are their story in the Bible? What does the story tell us about God? What lessons can we learn for our own lives from this woman? What are the cultural expectations and possibilities for her as a woman in that situation? How much agency or initiative does she exercise, or is she just a passive recipient of circumstances? And why does the Bible include this woman? What point is the text making? Before I finish, I think it's important to say that every time I speak to a large group of women, it includes women who have been or are still maybe in abusive situations or relationships, whether that be physical, emotional or spiritual. When the Me Too was going everywhere through the internet, I was frankly surprised not by how many, but the number of women who had been exposed to abuse and didn't speak up. What's our response in caring for these women? I want to suggest that there's 4 steps that we take, and these steps will take place over time. Believe them, believe in them, tell their story, and tell their story as part of God's story. Believe them, believe in them, tell their story as part of God's story. Let me unpack that. The first step, believe them. So often, women who've been abused are not believed by others. They wouldn't do that. The person you're talking about, I know, is someone quite different. Abusers tell victims that it's not happening or it's their fault. Sometimes it means saying to them that relationship's abusive. We need to offer them a safe space. Believe them and follow that up by believing in them. Abusive relationships undermine people's confidence. They lose confidence in their belief and their capacity to manage money, even simple life tasks. We need to believe in them as people of worth. They're being told all the time that it's their fault. They don't deserve anything else. They're not capable of anything else. Believe them, believe in them as the women God created them to be. And then tell their story. Friends, I'm so thankful that the Bible includes the texts of terror, the awful things that happen to women, the stories of the rape of Tamar, the stories of the Levitical concubine, because every other context writes them out, silences them, pretends they're not happening, or that it's normal or all right for that to happen. In contrast, the biblical narrative tells their stories and so often names the women, validates the fact that it's happening, and it doesn't assume that it's acceptable. The Me Too movement, those who tell stories of domestic violence, validate the reality of what's happening to people and make us aware that we need to act. The Bible publishes the stories even when the abusers are leaders, community, religious leaders or kings. It still says they were perpetrators. And it publishes the story of women who are ascribed community shame, but then continues on with their stories and how God went on to use them in his purposes. Which takes us to our last step. Tell their story. Tell their story as part of God's story. How God works out his purpose in people's lives, even in what they've been through. The story, the greatest story, is told of the crucifixion. It doesn't mean it's good. It was the most horrific event that happened in human and cosmic history, and yet God can bring greater good out of human sin. Unloved Leah, yet God honoured her and used her, together with Tamar, Judah's neglected daughter-in-law, Ruth, who was widowed and impoverished, Bathsheba, who was coerced by David as part of a messianic line. Help them to tell their story as part of what God can take up and redeem and use them as an important part of his much greater story. And I particularly want to refer to the Tamar campaign, which the churches in East Africa have done, Bible studies on some of these women, helping people to walk through abuse and violence. So friends, that wraps it up. What do we understand from the Bible about women and what they can and can't do? Well, I suggest when we ask what women can and can't do, we're asking the wrong question. We need to be asking what relationships, in the context of their relationships with God and of his people, what relationships bring honour to God? What relationships build up his people? And sometimes that'll involve us pushing the cultural bounds in ways that might be uncomfortable for us. At other times, it may involve fitting within the bounds of a culture in ways that are uncomfortable. We need to determine our behaviour according to what is required to build up the body of Christ and bring honour to God. And so I think a lot of the questions people are asking, a lot of the polarities between egalitarianism and complementarianism are just coming from the wrong direction. They're not really asking the questions the Bible asks. But I'd love to talk more about it. Please get back to me with questions. Looking forward to hearing from you. And the next slide has just a couple of suggested readings.